Hey everybody, I'm Juliana and you're watching Sprocket Girl. Today I'm particularly excited because I get to demo a bike at the Juliana Bicycles Ride Out. Juliana Bicycles is the women's line of the Santa Cruz bikes, and they have several models that you might be familiar with, such as the Furtado or the Joplin or the Roubion. Today I am going to be demoing the Roubion, and I'm very excited about this because first of all, I have never ridden a Juliana bicycle, even though we have the same name. And secondly, I am going to be riding it on one of my home trails, North Table Mountain, and this is a great opportunity for me to try out this new bike on a trail that I'm very familiar with and be able to compare it directly with how my Stumpjumper feels on North Table Mountain. So why don't you guys come along and let's check out what the Roubion is all about and how it feels. Here's my beautiful bike that I'm going to be riding. Some other bikes, woo, all lined up.
Do you all have a bike currently? Yes. Okay.
Both the Roubion that I demoed and my Stumpjumper are full suspension carbon bikes with 27.5-inch wheels. My Stumpjumper is a men's medium build with 150 millimeters of travel in the fork and also 150 millimeters of travel in the rear shock. The Roubion was a women's medium build with 160 mils of travel in the fork and 150 mils of travel in the rear shock. Now there are many aspects of these two bikes' geometry and their handling that I could talk about, but in this video I will focus on two aspects that I was particularly aware of while demoing the Roubion: the difference in their weight and the difference in their head tube angles. Let's start with the difference in weight. This is a little bit of a tricky thing to talk about because the weight of a bike depends on so many things, such as the exact size of the bike, the material it's made out of, the specific components, the tire size, and many other things. However, I did do a little bit of online reading and managed to figure out that the Roubion setup that I rode is roughly 1.5 to 3 pounds heavier than my own Stumpy. And I definitely noticed the difference in weight, especially on the initial climb up the switchbacks on the eastern side of North Table Mountain. The Roubion just feels like a much heftier bike compared to my ultralight Stumpjumper. This was especially apparent to me on the climbs where I felt like I had to push a lot more weight uphill and pedal harder than I was used to, whereas the Stumpy is so light it just seems to fly over obstacles sometimes. Also, full disclosure, I also wasn't feeling great physically on that day, so that might have contributed a bit to feeling like I had to pedal harder. However, on the downhill, I also noticed that the Roubion seemed a bit more stable than my Stumpy, which has a tendency to jump around a lot, especially if I'm riding loose, rocky sections. This feeling of the Roubion being more stable could also be in part due to its head tube angle being almost 2 degrees slacker than my Stumpy's. For those of you who don't know which of the many confusing angles on your bike the head tube angle is, then maybe this explanation can help a little bit. So if you were to extend an imaginary line down through your head tube and draw another imaginary line through your front and rear hubs parallel to the ground, then the head tube angle is the acute angle between these two lines, so basically the angle at which your fork sits. A slacker head tube angle, such as the Roubion has, means your front wheel is further in front of your headset, whereas a steeper head tube angle, such as my Stumpy has, means your front wheel is more directly under your headset. Having a slacker head tube angle can have several positive effects on the way a bike feels. For example, your stability can be better because the wheels are further apart. Also, the fork can suck up bumps and jolts better at higher speeds because of this slacker angle. And it can also feel less like you're positioned over your handlebars, and you'll have less of that "I'm going over the handlebars" sort of feeling. On the other hand, having a steeper head tube angle can also have its benefits. For example, the bike's handling can be faster and more responsive. You can also experience better cornering in tight terrain with tighter turning radii, for example in a switchback. And then also, the bike's climbing performance might feel better and more efficient with a steeper head tube angle. I definitely noticed several of these aspects. For instance, it did feel like the Roubion's climbing performance was not quite as stellar as the Stumpy's, although this could also be partly due to the weight difference. It just felt a bit sluggish on the uphill, whereas the Stumpy almost jumps over obstacles because it's so light. However, there is one thing to note here, and that's if I'm not going very fast uphill, the Stumpy has a tendency to kind of twitch around more and get derailed on loose terrain, whereas the Roubion felt more stable at lower speeds going uphill. I don't necessarily feel like I'm positioned more over my handlebars on my Stumpy compared to the Roubion, so I can't really speak to that aspect. I think in that regard, my Stumpy's geometry and setup just fits my body shape and size quite well, so I just feel very comfortable on my own Stumpy. And then the last major difference that I noticed regarding the head tube angle was on the downhill. The Roubion definitely felt more like a tank, just plowing through smaller rocks and small drops without jumping around too much.
Woo! Yay! This is awesome! Oh my god. This bike is a beast. Woo!
Even at higher speeds, the Roubion felt quite stable and like it was absorbing most of the jolts, whereas my Stumpy has a tendency to bounce me around a lot, especially at higher speeds downhill on rocky, loose terrain. On the flip side, the Roubion did feel a little bit less responsive in tighter turns on a downhill, whereas the Stumpy is really great at weaving around obstacles and cornering in narrow turns.
So I'm back from the ride. I had an awesome time. It was so much fun demoing the Roubion, especially because I was able to do it on one of my home trails, North Table Mountain, which I usually ride with my Stumpy, so I had a direct comparison between the two. And I have to say, it was really, really fun, and I would absolutely recommend that you guys demo any bikes that you can. Yeah, thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you like this channel, hit the subscribe button, like some of my videos, and hit the bell button so you'll get notified every time